Imagine a city built on marble and blood, beneath the towering majesty of the Colosseum. In the humid, salt-slicked darkness of the hypogeum, men are trembling. They aren't just waiting to die, they are waiting to become a punchline in a divine comedy written in gore. In ancient Rome, the line between a civic holiday and a nightmare didn't just blur, it vanished. This wasn't just sport. This was the state-sponsored mechanics of cruelty, where the screams of the dying were drowned out by 50,000 citizens cheering for one more inch of steel. Today we peel back the gold leaf of the empire to reveal the rot beneath. From the stage myths where actors died for real to the predatory silence of the morning hunts, these are the spectacles that proved Rome's thirst for theatre was only matched by its hunger for human suffering. The sun rises over the limestone rim of the Colosseum, but for those shivering in the pits below, it is a black dawn. These are the Noxi, the hurtful ones, men and women stripped of their Roman citizenship and reduced to mere flesh for the empire's amusement. As they are forced up the narrow ramps, the scent of the arena, a suffocating mixture of fresh sawdust, expensive incense, and the copper tang of old blood, fills their lungs. They are bound to thick wooden stakes or cast into the center of the ring with nothing but a loincloth to protect them from the gaze of 50,000 cheering spectators. This was the Damnatio ad Bestias, a spectacle where the Roman state performed its ultimate act of domesticating terror. Far beneath the sand, the heavy wooden floorboards groan as massive bronze winches begin to turn, pulling cages upward through a complex system of pulleys. From these darkened trapdoors emerge the executioners, starved leopards from the Atlas Mountains, massive bears from the Danube, and lions whose manes are matted with the filth of the underground pens. These creatures have been kept in total darkness and teased with the scent of raw meat, driven into a state of predatory delirium by handlers wielding red-hot irons and whips. When they finally burst into the blinding Mediterranean sunlight, they are not merely hungry, they are weapons of mass destruction, confused and lethally volatile. The crowd leans forward in a unified, hungry silence, their eyes fixed on the uneven match between human vulnerability and primordial power. Unlike the gladiatorial bouts that would follow in the afternoon, there is no pretense of skill or the possibility of a fair fight in this morning's session. The prisoners, often Christians, prisoners of war, or common thieves, are frequently tied together to prevent them from running, forcing them to witness the end of their companions before their own. It was a voyeuristic study in the breaking of the human spirit, where the screams of the condemned were considered a melodic accompaniment to the morning's light refreshments. As the first beast lunges, the spectacle shifts from theatre to a visceral mechanical processing of human bodies that leaves the sand soaked in dark crimson. The lions do not kill with the swiftness of a hunt in the wild. In the chaotic noise of the stadium, they often maim first, dragging their prey across the arena floor as the audience roars in approval. Roman writers of the time spoke of this as a purification of the city, a way to export the violence of the frontiers directly into the heart of the capital. It was a literal demonstration that anyone who defied the Roman peace would be devoured by the very wilderness the empire claimed to have conquered. By the time the midday sun reaches its zenith, the arena floor is a graveyard of shredded tunics and unrecognizable remains, yet the machinery of Rome never pauses. Special attendants dressed as Charon, the ferryman of the dead, roam the sand to ensure no one is feigning death, poking the bodies with heated metal rods. The blood-soaked sand is quickly raked over by a fresh layer of white grit, hiding the evidence of the morning's slaughter to prepare for the next round of entertainment. This cycle of consumption and concealment was the heartbeat of the Roman holiday, a cold reminder that in the eyes of the Caesars, a human life was worth far less than the cost of the beast that ended it. The morning sun glimmers off the marble, but the atmosphere shifts from raw animal fury to a much more sinister form of high art. This is the stage for the fatal charades, a grotesque innovation where the Roman love for classical theatre collided with their pathological need for public execution. In these displays, the arena was transformed into a lavish stage set, complete with artificial forests, mountains, and flowing rivers designed to replicate scenes from ancient mythology. However, the lead actors were not professionals, but condemned criminals forced to play out the deaths of gods and heroes with terrifying literalism. It was a world where the script was written in ink, but the final act was always performed in spurting arteries. In one corner of the sand, a prisoner dressed in the silk robes of Orpheus might be handed a lyre and told to charm the world. As he begins to play, the trapdoors open, But instead of the enchanted creatures of legend, a pack of starving rabid wolves is unleashed upon him. The audience, well versed in the classics, watches with a scholar's eye to see if the prisoner dies with the grace expected of a tragic hero. There is no stunt double and no stage magic to save him when the wolves close in to tear the throat from the musician. The crowd cheers not just for the death but for the aesthetic accuracy of the gore as it spills onto the prop trees. Perhaps the most infamous of these spectacles involved the recreation of the myth of Icarus, where a man was fitted with wings of wax and feathers. He would be hoisted high above the arena floor on a series of hidden pulleys and ropes, meant to soar before the eyes of the emperor. At the climax of the performance, the mechanics would intentionally fail, or the sun would be represented by a burst of flame that ignited the flammable glue. The prisoner would plummet through the air, his frantic screams silenced only when he shattered against the hard-packed earth in front of the royal box. For the Roman elite, this was not viewed as murder, but as a living masterpiece of poetic justice. Another common play featured the hero Mucius Scaevola, who famously proved his bravery by holding his hand in a fire without flinching. In the arena, a prisoner would be forced to recreate this feat of endurance, but with his hand chained over a brazier of white-hot coals. If he pulled away, he was whipped or prodded with spears. If he held still, the smell of his own roasting flesh would fill the lower tiers of the stadium. The psychological cruelty was calculated to break the man long before the fire consumed his limb, turning a story of Roman stoicism into a mockery of the victim's agony. This perversion of history served to reinforce the idea that only true Romans possessed the virtue of courage. As the final actor is dragged away by hooks, the stagehands begin to dismantle the scenery to make room for the next set of horrors. These charades were a tool of psychological control, teaching the masses that even the most beautiful stories belonged to the state and could be weaponized at will. The prisoners were stripped of their own identities and forced to die as caricatures of a culture that viewed them as less than human. By the time the props were cleared, the sand was a mosaic of broken wood and human remains, a silent testament to a city that required its blood to be served with a side of poetry. The line between the audience and the executioner had completely vanished into the spectacle. The Damnatio began not with a roar, but with a transformation of the arena into a haunting, artificial wilderness of impossible scale. Within minutes, the vast desert of the Colosseum floor was overtaken by a surreal landscape of imported palm trees, jagged rocks, and intricate scenery designed to mimic distant lands. This was Rome's way of bringing the entire known world to its feet, showcasing the absolute dominance of the empire over the wild and the unknown. Behind the beauty of the foliage, however, lay the mechanical hum of hundreds of trapdoors preparing to release thousands of terrified, confused animals. It was a botanical garden built on a foundation of terror, where the greenery was destined to be stained by the lifeblood of 3 continents. From the dark pits emerged a parade of nightmares. Tigers from India, rhinoceroses from the Nile, and elephants that had been marched across the Alps. These creatures were not merely released, they were goaded into a frenzy by bestiari, hunters whose sole job was to orchestrate a genocide for the sake of public amusement. The sheer scale of the slaughter was staggering, with records claiming that 11,000 animals were killed during the games celebrating Trajan's victory over Dacia. The air grew thick with the scent of pine boughs and perfume sprayed by hidden pipes to mask the overwhelming stench of animal musk and fresh entrails. For the Roman citizen, this was the ultimate display of luxury, seeing the rarest treasures of the earth destroyed in an afternoon. The hunters themselves were often slaves or low-born men, yet they were armed with spears and bows to perform a choreographed dance of death. They moved with a predatory grace, cornering magnificent predators that had never seen a human, let alone an army of them, in a confined space. There was no escape for the animals. The high walls were polished to prevent any leopard from leaping into the crowd, and archers stood ready to pick off anything that came too close. The crowd delighted in the noble struggle of the beasts, yet they cheered loudest when a spear found its mark, and a creature that had ruled a jungle fell into the dust. It was a systematic dismantling of nature, proving that no tooth or claw could ever match the cold steel of Rome. The ecological impact of these spectacles was a slow-motion catastrophe that echoed far beyond the walls of the city's stone amphitheaters. Entire species were pushed toward extinction, and regions like North Africa were stripped of their apex predators to satisfy the ever-growing demand for new and exotic deaths. The lions of Mesopotamia and the elephants of North Africa vanished from history. Their lineages ended for a few hours of rapturous applause in the capital. This was nature's genocide, a flex of imperial muscle that told the world that even the wild was a slave to the emperor's whim. To the Romans, the extinction of a species was a small price to pay for a memorable holiday, a sentiment that reveals the chilling depth of their detachment. As the sun reached its peak, the Damnatio concluded, leaving the arena a graveyard of fur, tusks, and feathers that would take hours to clear. The carcasses were often hauled away to be butchered for meat or hides, ensuring that the spectacle was as efficient as it was brutal. This part of the games was a ritual of order over chaos, a message to the people that the emperor could tame the very earth itself. Yet beneath the triumph, there was a hollow rot, a civilization that found its greatest joy in the silence of a dead forest. The sand was raked once more, the trees were moved aside, and the stage was set for the next phase of human misery to begin. The dry heat of the afternoon is suddenly broken by the rhythmic thunder of massive lead pipes being uncorked deep within the stadium's foundations. Thousands of gallons of water from the city's aqueducts surge into the arena, transforming the blood-stained sand into a shimmering artificial sea in a matter of hours. This was the Naumachia, the most logistically insane and lethal spectacle ever conceived by the Roman mind to satisfy a bored populace. As the water rises, massive warships, true triremes and quadriremes, are winched into the basin, their wooden hulls creaking as they find their buoyancy in the cramped stone ring. The crowd watches from the heights, peering down at a blue stage that would soon turn into a frothing, crimson whirlpool of wreckage and gasping men. On the decks of these vessels stood thousands of mariners, but these were not the celebrated sailors of the Roman navy. They were the Naumachiarii. These men were condemned criminals and prisoners of war, forced to man the oars and man the battlements of ships that were destined to become their floating coffins. They were given real armor and sharpened blades, not for a fair fight, but to ensure that the carnage was as realistic and absolute as possible. Unlike a land battle where a man might find a corner to hide, the Naumachia offered no retreat, only the choice between the sword and the depths. The emperor would gaze down from his podium, a god presiding over a chaotic ocean, as the signal was given for the massacre to commence. The ships would collide with the bone-shattering force of several tons of oak and iron, the sounds of splintering wood drowned out by the screams of the rowers trapped below. Boarding parties would swarm across the decks, turning the narrow walkways into a chaotic slaughterhouse where there was nowhere to run and no room to maneuver. Those who were struck down fell into the churned water, where the weight of their bronze breastplates acted as a terminal anchor, dragging them swiftly to the bottom. It was a visceral, suffocating form of death, as the wounded struggled to keep their heads above the surface while being trampled by the boots of the living. The water, once clear and bright under the sun, rapidly darkened into a thick, murky soup of blood and splinters. For the spectators in the lower tiers, the spray of the water provided a refreshing mist, a sickening contrast to the reality of the men drowning just a few yards away. They watched the naval tactics with a clinical interest, cheering when a ship was successfully rammed or when a boarding bridge crashed down onto an enemy's deck. There was a unique cruelty to the Naumachia. It turned the vast, honorable tradition of naval warfare into a claustrophobic, man-made trap for the amusement of the idle. The screams of the dying were echoed by the acoustics of the stone walls, creating a haunting symphony of industrial-scale homicide that lasted until the last ship was a floating wreck. Even the survivors were rarely granted mercy, as the state viewed them as mere biological props in an expensive play. As the battle concludes, the great drains are opened, and the water begins its slow, gurgling retreat back into the Roman sewers, leaving behind a scene of utter devastation. The floor of the arena is revealed once more, but it is now a swamp of bloated corpses, shattered masts, and the tangled remains of the Naumachiarii. Slaves with hooks wade into the mud to drag the bodies away, clearing the wreckage so the sand can be replaced for the afternoon's gladiatorial matches. The Naumachia was the ultimate flex of Roman engineering and imperial ego, proving that even the elements of nature could be forced to serve as an executioner. The sea had been conquered, the ships had been sunk, and the crowd was already calling for the next round of blood to be spilled. The gladiators were the icons of the arena, yet their fame was a cruel illusion that masked their reality as high-priced, disposable property of the state. These men, often prisoners of war or rebellious slaves, were the living embodiment of the revenge of slavery, trained in elite schools only to be sacrificed for a holiday. Their bodies were sculpted into weapons, but their spirits were kept in iron shackles, living under the constant shadow of the lanista, the master who traded in their lives. To the Romans they were celebrities, but to themselves they were ghosts waiting for a signal to finally depart the world. Every victory they claimed was a paradox, as it only bought them another night of survival in a cold stone cell. The bond between gladiators was forged in blood and shared trauma, creating a brotherhood of the damned that the audience could never truly understand. They lived together, ate a specialized diet of barley and beans to build protective fat, and practiced killing one another with a terrifying, mechanical precision. When they entered the arena, they were often forced to face their closest companions, men who had tended their wounds only hours before in the training pits. This was the ultimate psychological weapon of the Roman elite, forcing the oppressed to turn their rage against their own kind instead of the masters in the stands. The silence between two gladiators as they circled one another was a secret conversation of grief that the cheering crowd was entirely deaf to. When the steel finally met skin, the gladiator was expected to display a stoicism that bordered on the divine, even as his life escaped through a jagged wound. If a man was defeated but not killed, the entire stadium became a judge, holding the power of life and death in a single, silent gesture of the hand. The pollis verso, or turned thumb, was the final word on a man's worth, often dictated by nothing more than the fickle mood of a bored or bloodthirsty mob. A gladiator who had fought bravely might still be condemned if the crowd felt they hadn't seen enough carnage for their sestertii. He was expected to offer his throat to the victor without a flinch, turning his own execution into a final act of defiant, silent discipline. This system was a calculated tool of social control, designed to remind every slave in the empire that even the strongest among them could be broken for sport. By elevating a few to the status of legends, the Romans created a distraction that masked the systemic brutality of a society built entirely on the labor of the unfree. The gladiators' glamour, the portraits on oil lamps and the women who sought their favor, was a thin gold leaf draped over a mountain of nameless, unburied corpses. For every champion who earned his wooden sword of freedom, thousands more vanished into the lime pits of the spoliarium without a mark. Their existence was a tragic cycle, where the only way to prove one's humanity was to die with a dignity their masters did not possess. As the sun sets and the survivors are led back to their barracks, the echoes of the crowd's roar linger in the cooling air like a persistent fever. The heroes of the sand strip off their blood-crusted armor, knowing that the morning will bring only more training for a fight they can never truly win. They were the vengeful heart of a slave class that could only strike back through the theater of their own destruction, a tragedy that Rome watched with an insatiable, laughing hunger. The arena was not a place of sport. It was a factory of dehumanization where the strongest men in the world were turned into temporary toys. In the end, the gladiator was a mirror, reflecting the horrific reality of an empire that mistook its own cruelty for civilization. The lunch hour in the Colosseum brought no reprieve, only a transition into a more mechanical and hollow form of slaughter known as the meridiani. While the wealthy citizens retreated to the cool shade of their villas for wine and honeyed meats, the stadium remained open for the restless and the truly depraved. This was the time for the midday men, a sequence of executions disguised as combat that lacked even the prestige of the afternoon gladiatorial bouts. In the sweltering heat of the high sun, the arena became a factory of death, processing human lives with a cold, rhythmic efficiency that felt more like a chore than a celebration. It was here that the mask of Roman sport fell away completely, revealing the raw, unadorned skeleton of state-sponsored murder. The victims of the meridiani were typically the lowest of the low, unskilled criminals, runaway slaves, and those deemed unworthy of the expensive training given to gladiators. They were thrust into the glare of the noon sun, often blinking in the sudden light, only to find themselves part of a morbid game of musical chairs. Usually, one man would be given a sharp blade while his opponent was stripped naked and left entirely defenseless against the coming steel. The audience didn't look for skill. They looked for the primal, desperate scramble of a man trying to outrun the inevitable. There was no glory to be found in these moments, only a bleak and terrifying demonstration of how quickly a human being could be reduced to a piece of meat. The most twisted aspect of this midday butchery was its conveyor belt structure, designed to ensure that no one walked out of the sand alive. Once the armed man had dispatched his defenseless victim, he was immediately stripped of his weapon and forced to become the unarmed target for the next prisoner in line. This cycle of killing and being killed created a chain of blood that linked every participant together in a shared, hopeless destiny. The crowd watched with a detached, clinical boredom, occasionally shouting insults at a man who took too long to die or failed to provide a sufficiently gruesome spectacle. It was a carousel of carnage where the victor's reward was merely to be the next person to be slaughtered by a fresh hand. Attendants dressed as Mercury, the messenger of the gods, would pace the sidelines with heated iron rods to ensure that no one was feigning death to escape the cycle. If a prisoner collapsed from exhaustion or fear, he was prodded back to his feet by the searing heat of the metal, forced to face his end with his eyes wide open. The Meridiani served as a grim reminder to the remaining spectators that the Roman law was as inescapable as the stone walls of the amphitheater itself. There was a haunting silence to these hours, broken only by the wet thud of blades and the occasional mocking laughter from the tiers. In this space, the state proved that it could turn even the act of dying into a mundane, repetitive task. As the shadow of the Colosseum's walls began to lengthen, the last of the Meridiani were dragged away by hooks, their blood raked over with fresh, pale sand for the afternoon stars. The midday men were never given names, and their deaths were never recorded in the glorious annals of the games, vanishing as quickly as the noon heat. They were the sacrificial fuel for the Roman engine, killed during the interval simply because the arena could never be allowed to remain empty or peaceful. Their deaths marked the transition from the chaotic hunts of the morning to the disciplined violence of the professional gladiators. The lunch hour was over, the trash had been cleared, and the Empire's thirst for blood was once again ready for its main course.